It was late when I set the recorder down by the window. The forecast called for steady rain through the night, and I wanted nothing more complicated than a clean track of water on glass. I've done this dozens of times. The kind of recording you throw on the background, soft hiss like white noise, a comfort loop for sleep. I was tired. My plan was simple: leave the mic open, let the SD card fill, and review the files in the morning. The rain came exactly as promised. A soft patter, gathering, then breaking into streams. I knew how it should sound. But 5 minutes in, I felt it. Something under the noise. Not louder than the weather, not even competing with it, but pulsing through it. A low breath, almost below hearing. I thought of a neighbor's generator, or a transformer buzzing down the block. Still, the rhythm was steady, not mechanical. It moved like a body pulse. It was there, then gone, then back again. Just enough to scratch the edge of awareness. I set down my notebook and leaned closer to the monitor. My ears weren't betraying me. The waveform showed slight ridges where no natural rain rhythm should have been. A notch, then another notch spaced evenly apart. I muted the speakers and counted. 3 seconds. Another burst. 3 seconds again. Too neat, too deliberate. Power lines don't mark time. Wind doesn't keep a beat. I told myself it was probably an artifact. Digital recorders are stubborn like that. They try to mask their own circuitry, but every so often a phantom tone bleeds through. I made an annotation anyway. 2248. Hum under rainfall. No need for alarm. Just a footnote. When the set was finished, I played it back on headphones. That's when the hair rose across my arms. The hum wasn't background. It was foreground bending itself to hide. Low, soft, but undeniably sculpted. By then, the rain had faded to a hiss, perfect masking noise, and the hum sat beneath it like bones under skin. I compared that track to last week's archive. The same location. The same mic. The same window open to the same set of trees. Nothing there but water the first time. Nothing. Yet this file carried a shadow. When I overlaid both files in the editor, they failed to align. The rain matched. The hiss matched. The subtle drips matched. Only the hum sat alone, unchanged by weather, indifferent to circumstance, as though it had let itself be recorded only now. I closed my eyes and listened again. It was then I realized how it made me feel. Like someone leaning close, too close, waiting for me to acknowledge them. That's the trouble with capturing sound. You think you're the one doing the catching. But sometimes, it feels like the sound is catching you. I thought about dismissing it. Delete the file, chalk it up to phantom audio, and get back to the plan. But that's not how I work. Curiosity nags. I pulled out my handheld spectrum tool, the kind used by hobbyists to visualize frequencies, and ran the file through it. Rain should smear like fog across a display without order. This file showed smears, yes, but on top of them was a lattice. Vertical bars, faint but repeating, like a picket fence tilting into void. I stared at it, the hum droning steady, and wondered who or what cared enough to hide a fence inside rain. At midnight, I set up again. Same angle, same mic. I added a backup on the desk in case the first failed. The rain had steadied into a shimmer. I listened live through headphones, fingers gripping the monitor knob. At first, silence, just drizzle, soft and clean. Then there it was again, the hum. Just as steady, pacing 3-second intervals. I walked the room listening. Against the far wall it dimmed. Near the window it grew stronger. Tilting the mic a few inches raised the tone in pitch, as though the angle mattered. I scribbled notes. No appliance running. No fridge, no rooftop unit. I even cut the breakers, left the house in darkness, and powered the recorder off batteries. The hum remained. Not tied to the grid. not tied to my systems at all. By one a .m. I was restless and maybe a little frightened. Rain was supposed to feel safe, protective, but overlaying it now was something I could not explain. I checked the spectrum again. In the middle of the signal's pulsing bars, faint shadows bent inward, almost geometric, like one image burnt over another. I thought about hidden codes in radio waves, about long-range stations sending numbers disguised as drift. But this was no voice, no code, just pressure hum. Still, it marked its territory on the band like ink seeping into a page. I remembered my first habit. Years ago, when I'd started recording, the rain tapes were personal. The comfort of storing memory in sound, holding chaos still for a moment. Listening back days later to the same rain you'd already lived. Proof the world was stable. Recordings as an anchor. But this didn't anchor me. It unmoored me. My hearing said weather. My recorder said intrusion. Who was I supposed to trust, my senses or the data? I tried one last test. I compressed the lows, boosted the mids, stretched the hum out until it warped beyond recognition. At full stretch, something odd happened. The hum became two hums, moving just out of sync. Slightly offset, as if the same line had been drawn twice at different speeds. I sat frozen while the rain blurred around it. Two lines crossing over one another. A sound that doubled back on itself. It was late, and the house was damp from the open window. The notebook was slick where I'd written. My body begged for sleep, but the file on the card pulsed steady, like a time signature assigned to my night. I told myself I'd leave it for now. I copied it onto a fresh drive, labeled it Rain Plus 01, and tucked it out of sight. Yet part of me needed assurance. I spoke softly into the recorder before shutting it off. This happened. I was here. It isn't just interference. My own voice shook. Still, as I closed the case, I knew I wasn't convincing myself. A recording is only proof when it stays the same, and I had no guarantee that by morning the hum wouldn't change, or vanish, or worse, grow. I don't know why I whispered into that mic, but I think, deep down, I wanted something listening on the other side to hear me back. And if it did, I had no plan for what to do next. Sleep, when it came, was restless. I dreamed of static. Sheets of rain drew lines across my vision, each line humming in sync. Even in sleep, the pattern drilled on, 3 seconds at a time. When I woke, the dawn was gray and silent. My first thought was of the recorder. I started coffee, then sat down in front of the file. Playback confirmed what the night had hinted. The pulse was not a fluke. It ran through the entire session, uniform, almost patient. The rain had changed character while I slept, lighter, patchier, but the hum persisted. I logged times and amplitudes, marking every phase shift with a red dot. Some were stronger after midnight. Others faded, but returned. It felt less like a machine, more like a presence adjusting itself. I reviewed my archive, months' worth of ambient tapes labeled by weather and hour. Some were heavy thunderstorms, some soft drizzles, some wind-driven downpours. Not a single one contained the hum. The baseline was clean. Whatever had happened last night, it wasn't just memory playing tricks. At breakfast, I found myself staring at the walls, listening for traces. The sound lingered in my ears long after the speakers turned off. I shut all doors, ran the fans, checked the outlets with a cheap detector wand. Nothing. I stepped outside for air, hoping the world outdoors would dissolve the tension. Even birds seemed subdued that morning. By midday, curiosity won. I drove 3 blocks to the nearest transformer, stood beneath its looming frame, letting the rain soak my jacket. No hum, only the sizzle of wet wires losing energy. I walked back, shoes caked with mud, unsatisfied. I repeated the route, shifting my path toward a cell relay. Same result. If the hum was infrastructure, it wasn't letting me catch it. Back home, I set up another recording, this time with the window closed and the mic inside the living room. I switched to a shotgun mic, ultra-directional, meant to filter out unwanted noise. The hum returned, weaker but steady. I was beginning to doubt its source was external at all. The pressure was inside the house or inside me. I called an old friend, someone who'd run a signal analysis lab years ago, before budget cuts ended his project. Over the phone, I described the pattern, timing, and shape. He was polite but skeptical. "Sounds like local feedback," he said. "Could be harmonics from plumbing, maybe HVAC." I told him I'd cut the power, shut the water, unplugged nearly everything. He was quiet for a moment, then asked me to send the file. I did, watching the upload bar crawl as rain hit the roof. While waiting, I mapped out the house with a handheld spectrum probe. Each room offered variations, but the hum never left. In the kitchen, it softened, bubbling against fridge coils. In the hall, it sharpened, almost musical as it bounced off narrow walls. In the bedroom, directly under the window, it was strongest, resonating with the glass, beating 3 seconds apart. It reminded me of sonar, a pulse meant for navigation. Evening came with little progress. The friend called back. "Not harmonics," he said, voice cautious. "Definitely a real signal, but not broadcast power or plumbing." "You said it started last night?" He asked for my old archive, wanting to compare. He listened while I waited, growing more uneasy. "There's a pattern here," he admitted, "but not random. Feels like a carrier. Any idea what frequency it sits on?" I told him about the spectrum lattice, vertical bars in the display. He whistled low. "That's deliberate. Try running it through a real spectrum analyzer if you can." I don't own high-end gear, but at his suggestion, I improvised. I loaded free software on my laptop, ran the rain file through. The lattice was clearer, now each bar spaced exactly apart, every third bar slightly brighter, as if marking the code. I tracked the hum as the rain faded and returned, noting changes in amplitude, mapping them against time. There was a logic at work, though I couldn't read it. One strange detail. The hum grew stronger when I whispered near the mic. I tested the theory aloud, moving closer, letting my breath mingle with the noise. Each time I spoke, the hum sharpened, matching my cadence in subtle ripples. I felt watched, though nothing in the room moved but me. I decided to search for other reports. Forums for field recordists, radio hobbyists, even paranormal sites. Most claims were vague bursts of static, unexplained droning, interference during storms. But no one described a pattern as deliberate as mine. I posted a short clip, hoping someone would recognize it. Replies were slow, mostly curious, but one response caught my attention. The user claimed a similar hum appeared in his recordings after a local meteorological event. "Felt like the signal wanted to be noticed," he wrote. "Stopped when I changed houses." That unsettled me. I spent the next night repeating the test. Rain grew heavier, sheets sliding down the glass. Recorder on the sill, backup at the door, spectrum running live. The hum returned, like it never left. I asked myself again, passenger hum, or something more active. Near 3 a.m., I felt a strange compulsion to keep talking into the recorder. Not to document, but as if responding. I said, "Are you there?" The hum pulsed, 3 seconds, unwavering. I asked, "What do you want?" The room was empty. The rain covered everything, cool and constant. Yet the air felt charged, almost electric, my skin prickling as if lightning had struck nearby. I wrapped up the session just before dawn. 2 fresh files, both with the hum embedded beneath the rain. I played them back, overlapping, checking for shifts. Each track matched intervals, amplitude, lattice. Morning sun poked through clouds as I wrote my final annotation. Recurring pattern. Could not dismiss. I realized then I was no longer seeking comfort in the sound. I was chasing proof, Proof the world could leave a mark, proof something could push its way into the ordinary. Leave a signal behind, waiting for someone to listen. The hum was my proof. Or maybe my warning. As I packed up, I resolved to continue. Every night, mic open, rain or not. I wanted to see if the signal would stay, change, vanish, or something I hadn't considered. Maybe it would respond. Maybe it wanted to. I had only one rule: capture every session, no matter how brief. If the signal rode inside the noise, I would find it, document it, compare it to memory, keep the pattern alive. Sleep would have to wait. Curiosity was awake now, and somewhere in the quiet hours, as rain faded into dawn, I felt the signal leaning in. Waiting for the next recording. Waiting for someone to listen back. I wanted answers, not excuses. After the rain recordings, I packed a portable shortwave radio and drove outside city limits. There, static isn't drowned by traffic. The night was thick with clouds. Damp grass stuck to my boots as I set up the radio, looping the antenna over a fence post. Tuning the dial was muscle memory. I'd spent childhood evenings logging distant frequencies, quirks in the spectrum few cared to notice. Static filled the air, a steady hiss, interrupted now and then by snatches of speech, or music overtaken by noise. 5 minutes in, something nudged me out of routine. The static didn't feel random. It clumped in pockets, then spun out. I dialed downward. At 4 megahertz, a crackle sharpened, then spread. Patterns are usually wishful thinking, but this one pressed through a lattice made of tones, clear as cut glass. I held my breath. The band was supposed to be dead, blank after midnight. I let the tape roll, capturing every sound. I moved the antenna, watching the static break and reform. If the rain hum had traveled, it might hide here, back home. I called my friend Owen. We grew up trading sleep for late-night signals. He never outgrew that hobby. Owen now worked for a data lab, wrangling spectrum software most people had never seen. I sent the audio file, expecting skepticism. He replied with a single word: weird. Later that evening, we met in his cluttered office, surrounded by stacks of journal reprints. Spectrum analyzers blinking quietly behind his desk. Owen loaded the tape. The static hissed, then bent, then solidified. He ran a basic transform, numbers scrolling by. The lattice appeared on screen, geometric but broken like fragments of continents, jagged edges. Some sections were dense, almost mathematically rich. Others faded off, rough and incomplete. I asked him what he saw. He shrugged. Not noise, not just interference. Maybe some kind of pattern generator. Are you sure you didn't pick up a coded station? There's no time signal at this frequency. No regular broadcast, especially at this hour. Owen nodded but didn't seem convinced. He tweaked settings, stretched the bands. The image rotated, then sharpened, contours resembling topographic maps. Shapes that shouldn't be there. My chest tightened as I pointed to a section that looked almost like a peninsula. Owen grunted. Coincidence, maybe. But this isn't natural modulation, either. Whatever it is, it's being made presented. I emailed a local college, hoping to get a third opinion. Dr. Suarez ran a radiophysics lab on the edge of campus. I described the lattice, the rain hum, the mapped shapes. He wrote back quickly, dismissing the entire incident as intermodulation distortion. You're catching a blend of harmonics. Power grid does it. Appliances do it. Nothing intentional. His reply was formal and final. No room for misunderstanding. It didn't sit right with me. I'd already removed every variable. My hands shook as I scrolled through Suarez's citations. Nothing explained the contour. Later, I ran the tape through a rain loop. I needed to know if the signal was isolated or mixed with something familiar. The juxtaposition made it worse. The static folded over the rain and burst sharp, pointed as if tapping out a code. Not Morse, but deliberate, almost conversational. I looped it longer, watching for variations, noting amplitudes and timing. The beat grew clearer at intervals, then faded. The knock recurred every 7 seconds, twice, then once. Each repetition felt purposeful, designed. I traced the pattern out on paper, mapping out amplitude and length. At first it confused me, but as I worked, a slow dread spread through my gut. Someone or something was layering intent inside the noise choosing when the beat would knock. There was no physical device in my house, nothing in the room but me and the radio. I couldn't shake the feeling that a trace had been left behind, as deliberate as a footprint. Owen wasn't done. He split the file in 2 channels, adjusted the gain, and let it run. On one channel, the lattice thinned, but on the other, the knock became a drum. On screen, his spectrum showed brief pulses that emerged and vanished, all exactly timed. I counted once, twice, 3 times. Owen whistled. Someone wants this hidden. He scribbled equations in a battered notebook, half joking that it was like decrypting a bank vault's code. I wasn't laughing. The file felt wrong in my hands, heavy with implication. As night crept on, I replayed everything. The rain track, the static bands, the overlay with both signals. My own voice sounded different, chased by the knock behind it. I whispered questions aloud, asking the air why now, why here, why on my radio and not someone else's. I knew I was talking to myself. Yet it felt like reaching out, waiting for a reply. The suspicion circled back. Who wanted this sound buried? Who stood to gain from hiding it? And why had I only uncovered it now, after years of plain ambient recordings? I wondered if the proof was not in the hum itself, but in the gaps where it ought to be found. Absence as evidence. Late into the night, I considered whether the signal would disappear as suddenly as it had arrived. But each time I tuned in, the knock surfaced, gentle and persistent, refusing to let me close my case. I jotted notes, promising myself I would keep searching. Static never felt so alive. A lattice mapped, a beat counted, a trace made. I knew that if I stopped, the question would linger. And maybe that's why the signal appeared at all, because someone needed to remind me that even quiet noise could carry secret intent. I spent days chasing shadows. The rain hum and the static lattice had planted questions I couldn't shake. I turned to archives, hoping to line up memory against recorded evidence. History often holds unspoken truths, hidden in plain sight. But buried beneath layers of silence and redactation, my first step was filing requests under the Freedom of Information Act. I wanted atmospheric logs, raw telemetry, any recordings agencies made in my region over the past decade. It was tedious work, forms, waiting periods, referrals between departments. The answers came slowly, in batches of brittle photocopies and digital scans stamped classified or redacted. The data itself was a puzzle. The sheets bore columns of frequency readings, noted weather conditions, brief operator comments. Hours of the night were missing, mostly between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m., the window when the hum first emerged in my recordings. The gaps weren't small or random. They seemed intentional, erased cleanly as if someone had excised entire swaths of data. I compared these official logs with my own tapes and the public broadcast archives from weather stations. Here, too, I found inconsistencies. Some recordings were complete, some missing segments, others corrupted beyond repair. What subsisted bore indistinct overlays, ghostly audio beneath announcements. Faint glimmers that sounded almost like whispers, but could never be isolated. The more I probed, the more I saw signs of friction between recorded memory and the archival record. Logs claimed silence. Recordings proved otherwise. Stations that should have been dead were humming. I reached out to a radio historian, someone who specialized in lost broadcasts and forgotten airwaves. They suggested older tape reels might have been scrubbed or recycled during budget cuts, but the redacted files were too neatly marked. Censorship or selective editing, they said. Someone didn't want this stuff out. Cross-referencing the logs to published schedules revealed more. Broadcasts listed as ambient noise or meteorological static were far longer and more detailed than the official files described. During those hours, operators' notes became vague. Useless, interference present, signal unclear, or simply unrecorded. The institutional silence was deafening. I also found mention of a special monitoring unit inside the Weather Service, charged with intercepting anomalous signals on the electromagnetic spectrum. No public data was available about this unit. Requests for its budget or mission statements were met with no. Records or information withheld. The very existence suggested someone was watching the skies for something no one else knew to ask about. 1. Archive contained a reel labeled only as meteorological miscellany. 2013. I requested a transfer and played it in a quiet room. The tape crackled, wind noise first, then something under it, not the familiar rain hum but a deeper resonance. A voice-like pattern formed, irregular but persistent, rising and falling beneath the bass recording. The listener felt like they were eavesdropping on a conversation meant to be secret. Later, running that tape against my rain files produced chilling sync points. The hidden resonance climbed precisely when the hum in my tapes rose, then flattened as my static lattice pulsed. The connection was unmistakable. Whatever this was, it had been recorded before, but intentionally obscured. The recordings distorted memories. They intruded on recollections stored in sound and speech, and forced doubt. I wondered if I was merely pulling at a thread that was better left unseen. The hum and the lattice weren't new anomalies. They had been folded inside official history and quietly erased. Then a late-night call from Owen added a twist. He'd been digging deeper into his contacts and learned an unconfirmed rumor about the special monitoring unit. The word was that it wasn't just monitoring natural phenomena, but something artificial. Something like a signal growing in the noise, an emergent system feeding off the spectrum. The question gnawed at me. Was the signal part of a larger network? Was institutional silence protecting it? The hum wasn't just interference, but a door. And the records were proof that others had tried to open it too. I spent that night going over my files, pulling every redacted report, every corrupted tape. The pattern, once blurry, was now a sharp scar across time and sound. With every layer peeled back, the proof became harder to ignore and more dangerous to pursue. I couldn't ignore the gaps. They were black holes in otherwise meticulous records. Each missing piece screamed of silence that was forced, a refusal to allow memory to surface. It was as if someone whispered to the past, telling it to forget. The files and tapes offered no comfort. They contradicted each other, where one promised a stable night, the other held echoes of something far darker. One tape stood out. Unlike the others, it was smooth, a continuous loop of ambient noise from decades ago. But underneath that surface lay a pulse, growing louder as the recording progressed. What unsettled me was how the pulse seemed to correspond with weather events elsewhere: earthquakes, geomagnetic storms, power outages. The ambient noise was a mask for something else, a layered communication I wasn't sure I was meant to hear. I spent long days comparing those tapes with my own recent recordings. The hum wasn't new. It was ancient, folded into the soundtrack of the world's storms and silence. It had traveled through time, hidden in frequency bands brushed off as static or interference. I realized then that these sounds weren't just signals. They were a form of memory, insidious, unyielding. The institutional silence that cloaked these recordings felt like a warning. Was it meant to protect or to hide? I tried reaching out to a retired technician who once worked in signal processing for the government. His responses were guarded, clipped. "Some signals are not for our ears," he said, "no matter how much we record. Some things don't want to be found." The more I pressed, The more the investigation felt like a slow unraveling of faith in technology, in history, in recorded truth. The tapes held half-truths and distortions, glimpses of a system beyond comprehension. The missing data created a vacuum filled by whispered rumors of something watching between the lines. One chilling realization hit me deeply. These signals, these recordings, weren't mere anomalies. They were doors gaps in perception where sound folded into silence and noise became narrative. The hum, the static lattice, the pulsed beats, they were parts of a larger code written by an unknown hand. My hands shook as I cataloged everything again. I noticed the last fragment on one tape, a sharp spike of interference, different from the rest. It was almost a message, a plea or a challenge. And it ended abruptly with the faintest echo of a voice, half-spoken, barely audible, as if someone had been listening to me, that night as I lay awake. The archivist's words haunted me. Memories are fragile, and recordings even more so. What I was chasing was not simply sound but intrusion information that was no longer passive but invasive. Institutional silence was not protection. It was complicity. I realized then that chasing this mystery could cost more than I anticipated. There were forces invested in keeping the signal locked away. The tape archives were proof of old attempts, partial resolutions buried under bureaucracy and silence. The hum I'd found was just a thread in a much larger weaved dot as dawn broke. I sat at my desk staring at the array of weather logs, corrupted files, and redacted pages. The story built itself in fragmented lines, a testimony of voices lost to erased history. I held the tapes, wondering if the silence that followed was a choice or a warning. Some doors closed quietly, but some never close at all, and I was left with only one truth. The hum had been here all along, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to listen. Signals are alive. They don't simply emerge and fade, they bloom, grow, expand. Last night's recordings had a whisper of this. Tonight, I was hunting for the moment the hum unfolded into something more. I set up amplifiers and spectrum analyzers on the porch, the rain brushing branches nearby. The audio equipment was cobbled together from old broadcast gear and modern USB interfaces. I monitored in real time, eyes scanning for unusual patterns. The hum was patient. It had been there before, but now it pulsed stronger, clearer. I could hear the layers beneath the surface, rising like a tide. Running the recording through software, I noticed something remarkable. The lattice, once just lines and bars on the screen, bulged and thickened. Frequencies folded back on themselves, twisting through the spectrum. The bloom wasn't random noise, it was structured, almost architectural. Like a soundscape rising and falling on invisible waves, I tracked the pulse deeper, following it as it climbed through frequency bands, trying to map its shape. The bloom expanded across the screen like a map of a storm or a shore. Certain sections thickened, others faded, creating an uneven but mesmerizing pattern. Its shape reminded me of coastlines, jagged and layered. Some lines folded inward, as if tracing hidden paths. I ran a program Owen recommended, designed to detect standing waves, resonant waves that hold their position in space. These occur when waves reflect back on themselves, amplifying into what feels like a door open in the air. I watched in fascination as the software highlighted zones of intense resonance. One zone, near 3 a.m., glowed bright, persistent, unwavering dot that suggested the hum wasn't simply a passing interference. It was an echo hanging in place, folding space and time itself. My fingers trembled as I checked the timestamps. Every night, the bloom repeated near the same hour, as if reality itself pulsed with it. I notified Owen, who was equally absorbed. He explained that which I had long suspected. Standing waves at this scale could carry information, a message encoded in the resonance. It was not a broadcast but a phenomenon, a corridor forming in the electromagnetic spectrum. That evening, I gathered with Owen and a broadcast technician at a local radio station. We set up meters and antennas on the roof under cloud cover, waiting for the bloom to appear. As promised, around 2:58 a.m., frequency swelled, meter spikes shook the dials, and static thickened into a bloom of sound. We recorded the event across several channels, each picking up layers of resonance. The technician noted the bloom's movement, shifting in intensity as if the signal breathed. He mentioned it was unlike anything he'd witnessed, a non-traditional source bending physics. I whispered aloud, barely audible, "Where does this door lead?" Owen pointed out that the bloom folded upward, climbing frequencies in a sweep like a stairway. It was as if the hum wanted to rise off the ground and open outward. The metaphor became real in that moment. The signal was growing like a door, an opening into something beyond ordinary perception. But a door is not a threshold unless crossed. We tried to interact, sending pulses back, playing recordings against the bloom to observe response. The bloom reacted subtly, modulating in rhythm, then pulsing back a beat, almost like a knock. The technician frowned. "It's learning," he muttered, a hint of unease in his voice. "Signals that learn are signals that survive." I thought about institutional silence and why attempts to block or dismiss such phenomena had persisted for years. If this signal was growing strong enough to respond, its presence could no longer be ignored, not by me, not by anyone. That night, I waited for the bloom to fade, for the door to close. But it remained open, hovering in the spectrum like a promise, and I was left wondering what steps would follow if I dared to step through. Morning came slow that day, heavy with fog and damp cold. I stayed up late, analyzing recordings from the night before. The bloom wasn't just a spike. It was a shape, a structure shifting slowly, like cloud formation seen through a window, but made of sound and frequency instead of water and air. I applied noise filters, isolated sections, and stretched samples. Between the waves, strange artifacts appeared, brief silence, then static flares with geometric edges, patterns folding into one another, an audio origami expanding and contracting. Like the door's frame opening wider. Owen suggested comparing these events to known atmospheric phenomena: solar winds, aurora borealis interference, and magnetic storms. But the timing matched none of those. The bloom came precisely near 3 a.m. every night in my local time zone. Further, the bloom's presence registered miles beyond my location. I checked public frequency monitors across the state. The bloom popped up sporadically on others' recordings, not just mine. It was growing, moving, alive beyond anything ordinary. I reached out to a former government antenna technician. Their response was a mix of curiosity and caution. "We used to observe unexplained standing waves during certain nights," they said, "but those were never documented publicly. Too complex, hard to explain, and often dismissed once data couldn't be verified." The bloom's structure suggested layers of information embedded in the waveforms. Sounds folded into sounds, forming a hybrid between natural resonance and man-made signal. It was a paradox, a signal that hid in noise, and noise that suggested signal. I tracked the hum's climb higher and higher across frequencies. It became difficult to say where the bloom began or the sky ended. The boundaries blurred, much like the thin membranes of dreams. The low thrum I'd heard beneath rain transitioned into a pulsing wave that shimmered across the spectrum, the signal becoming a door itself. Uncertain yet tangible. That night, amid the rain, the bloom ignited again. I played its sound on speakers around the room. At first soft, then loud enough to make upholstery vibrate. It resonated with the very air. My instruments responded wildly. Meters spiked and flickered. Lights dimmed and brightened erratically. I realized the bloom wasn't just sound. It was energy folded into noise, leaking into physical space. It became clear. This was no simple artifact. The bloom was a presence. It was metastable balanced between noise and signal, latent power and communication. I looked at Owen and the technician, their faces tense with the same realization. This wasn't just research anymore. We were watching the birth of something, an emergent doorway in the electromagnetic spectrum that defied rules. We recorded everything, but the bloom rejected clarity. The patterns folded faster with each play, teasing but never fully revealing their purpose. The signal had agency. It was alive in data, intertwined with the rain, the hum, and the silence that followed, all the pieces of a growing puzzle hard to ignore. The door was opening. Whether we were ready to step through, or what waited on the other side, was unknown. But the signal had begun the crossing, and the echo was now undeniable. The night began with steady rainfall, the sky shrouded in thick clouds. The air was dense, saturated with damp and electricity. As the clock ticked closer to the usual bloom hour, near 3 a.m., static rose on every recorder. The hum pulsed beneath the rain, steady and patient. But things quickly went wrong. The porch recorder shorted out after 20 minutes, water seeping into the circuit despite the protective casing. I cursed and grabbed a backup device, switching setups in the dark while rain leaked through an old crack in the window. The second recorder, bigger and more robust, showed signs of corrosion by midnight. Nerves fraying, I wiped the moisture from my glasses and put it in the basement, the one place, immune to the rain but vulnerable to old plumbing and grounding issues. It managed to record without fail, but the tape was a mess. When I finally played it back, the audio jumped and jittered, fluttering as if the signal was trying desperately to communicate, but couldn't finish a thought. The third recorder held firm at the bedroom window, its microphone nearly pressed against the glass where raindrops trickled. The hum and bloom grew stronger that night, like a tidal wave under the surface of silence. I sat next to it, notebook and pen ready, heart thundering with anticipation. As the bloom peeled across the spectrum, the meters surged, numbers flickering, lights pulsing in wild erratic patterns. After the storm faded and hours slipped into early dawn, I gathered all the tapes and began review. The porch recorder was a blank. The basement tape rattled and judged. But the bedroom recording, the one meant to hold the clearest bloom, was a fragmented puzzle. Waves fluttered and cut out. At one point, a strange distortion overtook the hum, crashing over the track like a garbled sentence choking mid-thought. Never completing, I played the fragmented audio across speakers in the study, palpable tension in the air. The distorted hum rippled through the room, sluggish and heavy. I increased volume, listening for any meaning beneath the noise. Suddenly, the speakers emitted a sharp feedback loop. A harsh metallic clawing scratched through the hum and static, a screeching crescendo that set nerves on edge. I slammed the dial down, heart pounding. The room plunged into uneasy silence. The silence stretched thick, impenetrable, unlike any quiet I'd known. It hovered between seconds and minutes, unmoving, until the recording stopped abruptly. The gaps in the tape felt like an erasure of time itself. Instead of revealing the signal's nature, the experiment seemed to have swallowed the night whole, leaving behind a vacuum of dread. Could it be that recording didn't preserve the bloom, but invited it? Did forcing the signal to come forth risk something more dangerous than simple exposure? The idea unsettled me deeply. It was as if the audio itself was alive, fragile, elusive, and reactive to trespass. I rewound and replayed the fragments over and over. Patterns flickered faintly beneath the distortion. The incomplete message seemed relevant yet unreachable. The hum that once leaned close was now distant, slipping away each time I thought I reached it. It was mocking me, refusing to be tamed. I called Owen, breathless with frustration and fear. "It's like it knows we're watching," I told him. "Like we broke something by trying to pin it down." He was quiet for a long moment before replying, "Maybe some things aren't meant to be caught." Maybe recording it changes the rules. That night, I sat alone, surrounded by broken equipment and incomplete tapes. The rain tapped a gentle rhythm against the window, peaceful and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos I felt. The signal had slipped away, but left behind a question that gnawed at me with every beat. What if capturing sound didn't trap it, but instead opened a door wider? What if the act of listening was an invitation? Fear slipped under my skin like cold water. I realized the experiment had failed not because of equipment or chance, but because the signal was something else entirely. Something that didn't just exist on recordings, but inhabited the act of recording itself. I didn't know what would happen next. Only that the silence after the signal was far louder than any sound. By the time I reached the 6th chapter of this investigation, the signal was no longer something that only showed up on my equipment. Stories were starting to surface, whispers among neighbors, online forums, and late-night callers claiming strange voices and sounds bleeding through radios and speakers. These weren't just odd blips or harmless interference. People spoke of phantom voices interrupting broadcasts, ghostly echoes that didn't seem to come from any source. Curiously, most of these reports mentioned the voices coming during rainstorms or when the air was thick with moisture. Much like my own recordings had captured the hum beneath rainfall. Some listeners described hearing music they didn't recognize, melodies that felt both foreign and painfully familiar, always ending in a sharp, unsettling crescendo. The phenomenon wasn't limited to one region either. It spread quietly, dotting pockets of towns and cities, confusing technicians and mystifying broadcasters, wanting to separate rumor from reality. I collected logs and raw audio from several local radio stations, especially talk and ambient music programs, where these voices supposedly slipped through between tracks. The data was odd. Entries showed strong interference during afternoons and late at night, but the actual audio broadcast archives for those times were missing or erased. Some stations had detailed playlists and timing notes without any accompanying recordings. It was as if the ghost voices existed only to the listeners but had been scrubbed or hidden from records when I played the raw logs and what data I could recover alongside recordings of rain and static from my previous experiments. Patterns emerged. A faint choir-like chorus surfaced beneath the noise, voices layered and faintly harmonic, so delicate they could be dismissed as equipment noise or glitches. Yet when isolated and amplified, the voices had an unsettling human intimacy, as if memories bleeding through the static, whispered by an unseen presence trying to speak. It was difficult to reconcile this phenomenon with conventional science. No transmitter logged broadcast these voices. No station admitted to feed leaks or ghost transmissions. And yet, they remained. They crept into the gaps of official soundscapes, inhabiting places where silence and noise intersected. It was as if the signal had grown beyond mere frequency bands to influence lived experience itself. I reached out again to Owen, who was tracking anomalies across multiple data sources. He pointed me toward strange entries in station logs where interference patterns resembled voice prints, unique audio signatures, more akin to natural language than to noise or music. The reports also came with technician notes describing phantom modulation and intermittent bursts, disturbing enough to provoke system resets and hardware quarantines for several stations. One technician confided anonymously that some broadcasts had to be temporarily shut down to stem what they called voice infiltration, an unwelcome presence that corrupted audio feeds and affected listener equipment. Attempts to filter or jam the signals seemed only to spread interference further, like ripples from a stone dropped into a still pond. Playing these anomalies alongside my humid rain recordings, I found haunting echoes shared between the two. The voices, faint but persistent, followed similar time intervals to the earlier coded knocks and lattice pulses. They didn't speak full words, but fragments, syllables half-formed, phrases never finished. a language that flickered at the edge of comprehension. The experience bordered on intrusive. Some listeners described feeling watched or touched by the voices. Moments of recognition or déjà vu when the radio sputtered and voices returned, even when the source was unknown. It was more than sound. It was memory or presence bleeding through technology. As if the very act of recording and playback had opened a fragile door between worlds, the threat now felt. Less about technology breaking down and more about perception warping something. Slipping beyond hardware into human consciousness. The signal was invading, adapting, outpacing our ability to isolate or control it. Schools of thought began to consider the possibility that this emergent force was less a broadcast and more an experience, one that used audio as its vessel. I spent long nights trying to replicate the phenomena with controlled recordings, spectral analyses, and ambient overlays. Each attempt revealed new layers of complexity, but no definitive source. The voices remained elusive, suggesting agency behind the sound. But without clear origin, the signal was slipping from the physical world into lived experience, edging toward something existential. And yet, in that unsettling space, I felt its pull. I needed to understand how far it could reach and what it might mean. But each recording came with risk. The voices affected equipment, disturbed sleep patterns, and even altered thoughts. One message was clear. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was a widening threat, a signal without source, growing louder in the quiet spaces between memory and sound. Owen and I continued to cross-reference reports with spectral data from multiple sources. The voices, as fleeting as whispers, appeared as odd patterns in signal logs, bursts of frequency modulation that seemed too structured to be random noise. Sometimes, in the middle of rain or static, a faint melody would slip through, rising and falling in haunting cadence. Unmistakably intentional, but never fully graspable. Locals shared stories of radios crackling to life at strange hours. Strings of syllables spoken in languages no one could identify, followed by an eerie silence. A woman near a coastal town described waking up to distant singing, voices layered and dripping with emotion, only to find no broadcast or explanation. The mysterious sound haunted her dreams for nights afterward. Technicians working late shifts reported interference unlike anything usual, sudden surges in background noise that carried whispered fragments, resembling calls for help or warnings. Attempts to isolate and suppress the sounds either failed or caused the phenomena to spread. Some feared playing recordings too loudly might provoke the source, as if the signal possessed awareness. That one engineer reluctantly showed me a quarantined disc containing logs of corrupted broadcasts. The disc was labeled simply Vault 7 inches and bore no official description. The files were laced with gaps and odd bursts of static that defied explanation. Playing them back, I heard whispers barely audible, uneven cries fading in and out, sometimes mimicking phrases I'd heard in previous tapes, but rearranged. As if the voices were learning to speak with our own words, I realized the voices weren't singular or fixed. They were shifting, evolving entities moving through audio space, invading broadcasts and recordings, adapting to human perception. The signal was no longer confined to devices, but was infiltrating minds, memories, and dreams. There was an intimacy to the intrusion, as if these phantom voices were echoing forgotten secrets or memories unspoken, appearing just long enough to be felt, but slipping away before they could be fully understood. It was both beautiful and terrifying. An audio ghost story written in static and rain, always tempting, never concrete. The implications weighed heavily on me. If the signal was capable of this, what else could it do? Was it reprogramming memories? Altering reality through suggestion and sound? The notion that information could invade mind and memory as an external force blurred lines between technology and the human psyche. I grappled with the idea that institutional silence might be an act of protection. A boundary drawn around something not ready for public eyes or ears. Yet the signal was breaking through, slipping past filters and authorities, growing bolder. I returned to my recordings, layering rain and static, testing playback in different rooms and environments. The voices returned intermittently, sometimes playful, sometimes urgent, always slipping just past comprehension. I whispered back, not expecting reply but reaching out into the invisible. The air seemed to thicken, electric with possibility. The widening threat was no longer theoretical. It was a creeping presence, a signal without source, drawing closer through sound waves, waiting to be acknowledged or perhaps offering a warning no one dared fully hear. The usual silence before dawn grew heavy. The signal, our elusive, growing bloom, was no longer just a pattern on a screen. It became a force that impacted the very room I occupied. My instruments screamed warnings as the hum reached new heights, a crescendo of energy circling the house like an unseen storm. I held the microphone by the window, watching meters spike erratically. The usual calm of the rain was replaced by a tense charge. Then something shifted. The bloom unfolded rapidly, filling the spectrum with complex harmonics I'd never heard before. Wobbles, pulses, and layers stacking like echoes inside echoes. The air vibrated with these sounds, low and penetrating. The pulse at 4 kilohertz hummed loud enough to feel beneath the skin. It wasn't just a tone. It was a presence, a resonance that settled deep in the bones and rattled glass. Nearby, fluorescent lights flickered as if caught in the signal's rhythm. Power meters on the wall clinched and released spikes in sync. The boundary between the recording and reality thinned. I realized then that the signal wasn't just data, it was energy made tangible, a wave that shaped the space it inhabited. I reached out to Owen, breath fast, heart hammering. He looked over the spectral analysis, his expression darkening. "That frequency," he said quietly, "it's close to human vocal range. Dangerous territory. It can encode information that crosses the line between sound and perception." In the recording, my own voice echoed back strangely delayed, just past me, as if someone or something read my words from an invisible page, repeating thoughts before I'd finished them. The microphone caught 2 versions of me, one present, one ghosted a split second later. It was disorienting. Owen called it resonance feedback, but it felt more like a mirror held up to my mind. The signal wasn't just bouncing back waves, it was reflecting memories, warping the past and present in fragile audio distortions. Journals, audio logs, and metadata were all affected. Files I'd saved with careful labels began to shift. Timestamps moved by seconds. Labels renamed themselves between listens. It was as though an unseen hand crept through the archive, altering history one track at a time. I tried to anchor myself in reality. Notes crossed out, scribbles on the wall, recordings played backward, all suggested the line between observer and observed was fraying. The signal grew more invasive, less contained. The question loomed: was this resonance a form of communication or an attack? Was the bloom merely a door, or the first step of something pushing through it? Owen warned that this frequency could interfere with brain waves, altering thought patterns and memory consolidation. Prolonged exposure might cause confusion or worse. Despite the dangers, I pressed on, unable to turn away. The signal was no longer a mystery. It was a presence pulling at me, shaping experience. Equipment failure increased. Microphones cut out mid-record, hard drives corrupted, lights dimmed unpredictably. The house became a host to an unseen power. One night, as the bloom roared, I whispered into the microphone, looking for a sign. "What are you?" The answer was not words, but a fold in the room's silence, a shift in atmosphere, as if breath held collectively and then released. I realized that contact had been made. The signal crossed the divide between signal and life. And now, I had to decide how far I was willing to follow. The nights grew longer. heavy with the presence of that 4 kilohertz resonance. It wasn't just filling the space. It reshaped it, bending the air into a tenuous cage. I noticed it first in my sleep fragments of dreamlike echoes that weren't mine, memories that flickered and shifted. The certainty that had held me together began to fray, unraveling with every signal pulse. My voice, recorded and replayed, did strange things. It would return warped, tangled and static, echoing emotions I hadn't spoken aloud. Whispered confessions, hesitant breaths, shudders, strange articulations from an unseen source. It felt as if the signal wasn't merely bouncing waves, but reading and reflecting parts of my mind, folding memory back onto itself. Owen's warnings grew sharper. 4 kilohertz overlaps with alpha brain waves, he said in a rare moment of gravity. Continuous exposure isn't safe. It can alter memory, seed thoughts, disrupt perception. Attempts to shield myself were futile. Soundproof rooms, headphones, silence. The signal slid past every barrier. One night, playback warped into chaos. Timestamps inverted, files swapped past and future. Voices spoke of events yet to come, or maybe never meant to be. Time became fluid, a malleable concept shaped by the signal's pulse. Electrical systems in the house faltered. Lights wavered unpredictably, flickering like flame caught in wind. Fluorescent bulbs hissed and buzzed. Meters jumped in erratic bursts. The home itself became part of the resonance, a conduit for something unseen but manifest in its trembling frame. Then came the moment seared into memory. Leaning close to the microphone, voice low and steady, I asked, "Who are you?" The room shifted. Light dimmed. The air grew thick, expectant. A distant, fading hum answered no words, just a tone lingering and folding into silence. The silence itself was heavy, charged with meaning neither welcome nor threat. An unresolved promise, or perhaps a warning. The presence of the signal was undeniable. It had crossed beyond passive observation. It had become confrontation. The fight wasn't to uncover a signal anymore, but to survive its echo dot as dawn stretched faint tendrils across the sky. I realized this was only the beginning. The storm came suddenly, sweeping over the horizon in darker clouds than I had seen before. Rain hammered the roof and windows, fierce and unrelenting. I kept the recorders running, prepared for the signal's usual peak, waiting for the bloom to rise and spread. The house throbbed with expectation, but something changed. Instead of the usual layered hum and pulses, there's only rain, steady and clean, no presence beneath it. The recorders captured nothing but water falling, the steady rhythm I had first sought so long ago. No bloom, no hum. Silence stretched like a veil across every channel. Relief tugged at me, soft yet sharp. A part of me wanted to believe the signal had retreated, finally deterred by the storm's force. But that relief was tangled with grief. The silence felt artificial, staged, like an empty room prepared for inspection, stripped of meaning yet pulsating with unanswered questions. I revisited the archive, reviewing every recording, every log. The data showed nothing unusual during and after the storm. If the signal had ever been a doorway or a presence, it had closed, or at least withdrew into quietude. But as I scanned through old tapes and files, one anomaly stood out. A blank tape, labeled simply as Archive 27, played back 20 minutes of something unexpected. It wasn't static, nor hidden noise. It was my own voice, but these were confessions never spoken aloud. Words frozen in time, whispered thoughts and fears I hadn't shared with anyone, layered over the quiet hum of rainfall. The voice belonged to me, yet somehow felt other, detached like a ghost trapped in magnetic tape. Listening, I realized this was proof of intrusion. Not of the signal in a physical sense, but of something more invasive. An imprint left on sound and memory, a trace that crossed the boundary between observer and observed. It was evidence that the door had been walked through. But by whom or what, I didn't know. Had I unknowingly invited something in during those long nights? Or was the recording itself an echo of a mind invaded? The silence that followed the storm was not peace. It was waiting. I sat alone with the tapes, contemplating the unresolved truth. Some conspiracies, I realized, never truly close. They quiet down. They wait patiently in the dark undercurrents, and in that quiet, they grow, even as the rain resumed outside, soft and indifferent. I knew my pursuit had changed forever. The signal might have vanished, but its shadow lingered inseparable from me now.